The Last Penny by T.S. Arthur. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are within the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit www.librivox.org. Today's reading by Tom Hackett, djhackett.newgrounds.com. The Last Penny by T.S. Arthur. Thomas Clare, a son of St. Crispin, was a clever sort of a man, though not very well off in the world. He was industrious, but, as his abilities were small, his reward was proportioned thereto. His skill went but little beyond half-soles, heel-taps, and patches. Those who, willing to encourage Thomas, ventured to order from him a new pair of boots or shoes, never repeated the order. That would have been carrying their good wishes for his prosperity rather too far. As intimated, the income of Thomas Clare was not large. Industrious though he was, the amount earned proved so small that his frugal wife always found it insufficient for an adequate supply of the wants of the family, which consisted of her husband, herself, and 3 children. It cannot be denied, however, that if Thomas had cared less about his pipe and mug of ale, the supply of bread would have been more liberal. But he had to work hard, and must have some little self-indulgence, at least so he very unwisely argued. This self-indulgence cost from 2 to 3 shillings every week, a sum that would have purchased many comforts for the needy family. The oldest of Clare's children, a girl 10 years of age, had been sickly from her birth. She was a gentle, loving child, the favorite of all in the house, more especially of her father. Little Lizzie would come up into the garret where Clare worked, and sit with him sometimes for hours, talking in a strain that caused him to wonder, and sometimes, when she did not feel as well as usual, lying upon the floor and fixing upon him her large bright eyes for almost as long a period. Lizzie was never so contented as when she was with her father, and he never worked so cheerfully as when she was near him. Gradually, as month after month went by, Lizzie wasted away with some disease for which the doctor could find no remedy. Her cheeks became paler and paler, her eyes larger and brighter, and such a weakness fell upon her slender limbs that they could with difficulty sustain her weight. She was no longer able to clamber up the steep stairs into the garret, or loft, where her father worked, yet she was there as often as before. Clare had made for her a little bed, raised a short space from the floor, and here she lay, talking to him or looking at him, as of old. He rarely went up or down the garret stairs without having Lizzie in his arms. Usually her head was lying upon his shoulder. And thus the time went on. Clare, for all the love he felt for his sick child, for all the regard he entertained for his family, indulging his beer and tobacco as usual, and thus consuming, weekly, a portion of their little income that would have brought to his children many a comfort. No one but himself had any luxuries. Not even for Lizzie's weak appetite were dainties procured. It was as much as the mother could do, out of the weekly pittance she received, to get enough coarse food for the table, and cover the nakedness of her family. To supply the pipe and mug of Clare, from 2 to 3 shillings a week were required. This sum he usually retained out of his earnings, and gave the balance, whether large or small, to his frugal wife. No matter what his income happened to be, the amount necessary to obtain these articles was rigidly deducted, and as certainly expended. Without his beer, Clare really imagined that he would not have strength sufficient to go through with his weekly toil. How his wife managed to get along without even her regular cup of good tea it had never occurred to him to ask. And not to have had a pipe to smoke in the evening, or after each meal, would have been a deprivation beyond his ability to endure. So the 2 or 3 shillings went regularly in the old way. When the sixpences and pennies congregated in goodly numbers in the shoemaker's pocket, his visits to the alehouse were often repeated, and his extra pipe smoked more frequently. But, as his allowance for the week diminished, and it required some searching in the capacious pockets, where they hid themselves away, to find the straggling coins, Clare found it necessary to put some check upon his appetite. And so it went on, week after week, and month after month. The beer was drunk, and the pipe smoked as usual, while the whole family bent under the weight of poverty that was laid upon them. Weaker and weaker grew little Lizzie. From the coarse food that was daily set before her, her weak stomach turned, and she hardly took sufficient nourishment to keep life in her attenuated frame. "Poor child," said the mother one morning, "she cannot live if she doesn't eat. But coarse bread and potatoes and buttermilk go against her weak stomach. Ah me, if we only had a little that the rich waste." "There is a curse in poverty," replied Clare, with a bitterness that was unusual to him, as he turned his eyes upon his child, who had pushed away the food that had been placed before her, and was looking at it with an expression of disappointment on her wan face. "A curse in poverty," he repeated. Why should my child die for want of nourishing food, while the children of the rich have every luxury?" In the mind of Clare there was usually a dead calm. He plodded on, from day to day, eating his potatoes and buttermilk, or whatever came before him, and working steadily through the hours allotted to labor, his hopes or fears in life rarely exciting him to an expression of discontent. But he loved Lizzie better than any earthly thing, and to see her turn with loathing from her coarse food, the best he was able to procure for her, aroused his sluggish nature into a rebellion against his lot. But he saw no remedy. "Can't we get something a little better for Lizzie?" said he as he pushed his plate aside, his appetite for once gone before his meal was half eaten. "Not unless you can earn more," replied the wife. "Cut and carve, and manage as I will, it's as much as I can do to get common food." Clare pushed himself back from the table, and without saying a word more, went up to his shop in the garret, and sat down to work. There was a troubled and despondent feeling about his heart. He did not light his pipe as usual, for he had smoked up the last of his tobacco the evening before. But he had a penny left, and with that, as soon as he had finished mending a pair of boots and taken them home, he meant to get a new supply of the fragrant weed. The boots had only half an hour's work on them, but a few stitches had been taken by the cobbler when he heard the feeble voice of Lizzie calling to him from the bottom of the stairs. That voice never came unregarded to his ears. He laid aside his work and went down to his patient child, and as he took her light form in his arms and bore her up into his little workshop, he felt that he pressed against his heart the dearest thing to him in life. And with this feeling came the bitter certainty that soon she would pass away and be no more seen. Thomas Clare did not often indulge in external manifestations of feeling, but now, as he held Lizzie in his arms, he bent down his face and kissed her cheek tenderly. A light, like a gleam of sunshine, fell suddenly upon the pale countenance of the child, while a faint but loving smile played about her lips. Her father kissed her again, and then laid her upon the little bed that was always ready for her, and once more resumed his work. Clare's mind had been awakened from its usual leaden quiet. The wants of his failing child aroused it into disturbed activity. Thought beat, for a while, like a caged bird against the bars of necessity, and then fluttered back into panting imbecility. At last the boots were done, and with his thoughts now more occupied with the supply of tobacco he was to obtain than with anything else, Clare started to take them home. As he walked along, he passed a fruit shop, and the thought of Lizzie came into his mind. "If we could afford her some of these nice things," he said to himself, "they would be food and medicine both to the dear child. But," he added, with a sigh, "we are poor, we are poor! Such dainties are not for the children of poverty." He passed along until he came to the alehouse where he intended to get his pennyworth of tobacco. For the first time, a thought of self-denial entered his mind as he stood by the door, with his hand in his pocket, feeling for his solitary copper. "This would buy Lizzie an orange," he said to himself. "But then," was quickly added, "I would have no tobacco today, nor tomorrow, for I won't be paid for these boots before Saturday, when Barton gets his wages." Then came a long, hesitating pause. There was before the mind of Clare the image of the faint and feeble child with the refreshing orange to her lips, and there was also the image of himself incheered for 2 long days by his pipe. But could he for a moment hesitate if he really loved that sick child? is asked. Yes, he could hesitate, and yet love the little sufferer, for to one of his order of mind and habits of acting and feeling, a self-indulgence like that of the pipe, or a regular draught of beer, becomes so much like second nature that it is as it were a part of the very life, and to give it up costs more than a light effort. The penny was between his fingers, and he took a single step for the alehouse door. But so vividly came back the image of little Lizzie that he stopped suddenly. The conflict, even though the spending of a single penny was concerned, now became severe. Love for the child pled earnestly, and as earnestly pled the old habit that seemed as if it would take no denial. It was his last penny that was between the cobbler's fingers. Had there been 2 pennies in his pocket, all difficulty would have immediately vanished. Having thought of the orange, he would have bought it with one of them, and supplied his pipe with the other. But, as affairs now stood, he must utterly deny himself, or else deny his child. For minutes the question was debated. "I will see as I come back," said Clare at last, starting on his errand, and thus, for the time, making a sort of a compromise. As he walked along, the argument still went on in his mind. The more his thoughts acted in this new channel, the more light came into the cobbler's mind, at all times rather dark and dull. Certain discrimination